Thank you, appreciate it. And sorry, the session got delayed a little bit by about a couple of minutes. So there was some issue in this GoToWebinar software. So I just had to quickly restart the session. Okay, so let's start. My name is Fahim. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer. I'll be covering this particular session. So in this session, we'll cover what exactly an Azure Administrator is responsible for. And before I show you the agenda and we start discussing the topics, I'd like to ask to please make sure that you switch your microphone to mute mode. This way there will be no echo or feedback. And if you have any questions, feel free to type the questions in the chat window of this Zoom software. And yes, this session is getting recorded and you'll have access to the video as well as the audio. And it will be uploaded to our site and you'll get a link to it later on. And the slides will also be uploaded as well. So you'll also have access to the PDF file that contains all the slides and so on. Okay, so let's get started. So today's agenda is to discuss what exactly an Azure Administrator is responsible for. But before that, we will also talk about what exactly Microsoft Azure is. And we will also talk about the traditional roles that we usually have and how the roles they should consider upgrading themselves to Azure specific roles, because Azure or any cloud solution based roles, they are somewhat different compared to your on-prem sort of roles. Overall, administrators, they have the same responsibilities. It's just that in case of any cloud solution, we usually have a lot of additional tools and additional services available. So we have to be aware of some more things. Okay, so before we talk about the responsibilities and the roles, etc. and so on, let's have a quick overview of what exactly Microsoft Azure is. So before I discuss Azure on my end, I'd like to ask you guys to please raise your hand in this GoToWebinar session. If you have used Azure or if you are planning to migrate your solution to any cloud solution, or if you are already using cloud solutions, please raise your hand in our GoToWebinar session. Are you guys already using any cloud solution like Amazon AWS, Google GCP, Microsoft Azure? Okay, so very few of you guys are currently using it. Okay, so here we will cover pretty much everything from scratch, but please keep in mind that it's just a 1 hour webinar session. We do have full-blown advanced courses or detailed courses available on all these technologies. Okay, so Microsoft Azure, back in the day, it was called Windows Azure. And Azure basically means it's a cloud-based solution. And the reason why it's called Azure is because if you look at the sky is basically, it has the bluish sort of color. And Azure is basically the similar color. And when you look at the sky, there are endless possibilities. You can utilize the cloud solutions in various ways. It gives you lots of options, basically. And we will talk about some of the options in this particular session in just a bit. So it's an ever-expanding set of services. So pretty much every few days, weeks, months, you see more services on Azure. So it's not a product. It's not something that is set in stone. It will not change very frequently, like in case of traditional sort of applications that we have in an on-prem sort of environment. Usually things stay the same, and it's very rare that very drastic changes are introduced to the solutions. But in case of any cloud-based solution, it's an ever-expanding set of cloud services. And it gives us the freedom to build, manage, and deploy our applications. So basically, our goal is to make sure that we still get to run our applications. Our business activities should not be disrupted. We want to make sure that everything is accessible, but without spending any money on the hardware. So you do not want to purchase the hardware at all. Hardware-wise, on your end, you'll just want to use some low-end tablet or some low-end sort of laptop. You do not need any high-end processing capabilities on your end at all. Everything will be provided by Azure. It will be available on cloud, and you'll be able to connect to Azure and provision various types of services and connect to the services and so on. And benefits wise, when you use any cloud solution, you'll basically have high availability, because you'll be able to set up multiple backup solutions. So if your primary server has crashed, then you'll still have some alternate server up and running. So definitely high availability, scalability, these are some of the main benefits you get with it. And usually we say that it's an elastic solution, because elasticity means you should be able to scale out the system depending on your requirement. If there's too much load on the system, you should scale things out. If the number of users or the resources are not required that much, because there's less load on the system, we should scale things in. So elasticity should be there, or auto scaling should be there. So basically, these are some of the benefits you get with any cloud solution. And before we talk about Azure specific roles, let's quickly talk about some traditional roles. So in case of on-prem sort of setup, typically we have a system administrator who is responsible for setting up the hardware, install operating systems, set up various virtualization solutions such as VMware, Hyper-V, VirtualBox, and then typically the person is also responsible for configuring network as well. Like you get to create your networks and subnets, DNS, etc., and so on. You get to configure these things. And then typically we also have a DBA, database administrator, like a SQL Server, Oracle, DB2 sort of database administrator is there. We also have developers who develop the applications, and then we have to deploy them to some application server or web server and so on. And typically system administrators are responsible for installing and setting up the application servers, database server, or to some extent database servers. Otherwise, DBS can do that. Otherwise, web servers like IIS, Apache Web Server, etc., and so on. That is usually the responsibility of the sysadmins. And developers get to develop the applications, and then deployment can be done by the sysadmins. Then typically we also have architects involved as well, who set up the entire sort of high-level architecture of the application. And then depending on your requirement, even in your on-prem environment, we typically have a BI team, business intelligence team, that is responsible for creation of data warehouses, model the data by using analysis services or Cognos, etc., and so on. Then in more advanced cases, we have to implement some sort of predictive analysis by using data mining, etc., and so on. We get to use various algorithms, and then we get to develop or design our reports and so on. So these are the traditional roles. But when you use any cloud-based solution like Microsoft Azure, the roles are somewhat different. Like a typical system administrator or a network administrator will be known as an Azure administrator. And in more advanced cases, when you want to specialize in security, you want to secure your solutions, you'll want to become a security engineer. So typically, an Azure administrator should be an Azure administrator and also a security engineer as well. And a DBA is no longer just a DBA. A DBA has to know more services, because in case of any cloud solution like Microsoft Azure, we don't have just SQL Server databases, we have more options available to us. So definitely your SQL Server background will help you a lot, but you'll also want to get into more things like we have Apache Spark, we have Apache Hadoop, we have Apache Scoop, we have Azure Databricks, we have Azure Synaptics Analysis, Azure Data Lake is there. So there are tons of other things available. So a typical DBA will want to become a data engineer. Likewise, a typical developer who usually writes or develops application by using .NET, Java, Node.js, PHP, etc., and so on, will want to become an Azure developer. And in more advanced cases, the person will also want to become an IoT developer, Internet of Things developer, because there are quite a few companies who have started using various hardware devices or sensors. They have different sort of data gathering points, like you can get data from some home appliance or security equipment, etc., and so on. So you'll want to process that data in pretty much real time. So for that, we could use IoT on Azure. And if you are using continuous integration, continuous delivery, CI/CD basically, DevOps basically, you can choose to use DevOps in your on-prem environment, or in case of Azure, we have Azure DevOps available, and usually we have a role for it that's known as Azure DevOps Engineer. Likewise, the business intelligence team or the developers will want to become data scientists, where they get to use Jupyter notebooks, they get to use various other options, like there is artificial intelligence as well, and so on. So there are various roles available basically regarding the advanced or cloud-oriented business intelligence sort of solutions and so on. And definitely we also need to have Azure architects in place or available, so that they should suggest what the overall cloud solution should look like and so on. So just know that there are hundreds of services available on Azure. So definitely just a single or 2 or 3 roles are no longer sufficient. So we have specialized roles available. So here in this session, we will mostly focus on just the Azure Administrator role. So these are basically the official responsibilities that are available on the Microsoft website as well. So I've basically pretty much taken those paragraphs as it is from Microsoft website. So a typical Azure administrator is responsible for implementing, managing, and monitoring identity. So I'll talk about identity in detail in just a bit, but in a nutshell, that is basically equivalent to your Active Directory. So you'll want to manage your Active Directories, the users, etc., and so on. You'll also want to implement some governance sort of policies, so that there should be some rules and regulations in place, so that certain services should not be available, or you should provision your resources in a certain region of the world. Otherwise, pretty much any cloud solution offers data centers all over the world, and you'll want to restrict or limit the regions, like where exactly you can provision a certain resource, exactly what type of resource you can provision, what should be the capabilities of that sort of service. Like, do you want to create a virtual machine with 500 GB of, let's say, storage, and let's say 64 CPUs, and let's say 56 GB of RAM, etc., and so on. So you most likely want to restrict and create some governance sort of plan, so that all the consumers or users of your Azure environment should be limited to just certain resources and so on. So likewise, you get to configure storage. I'll talk about storage in detail in just a bit, but in short, it's equivalent to your on-prem RAID or NAS or SAN sort of thing. And definitely create your compute resources. That basically means create your virtual machines, and also create containers, Docker containers, Kubernetes. So here in this session, I'll give you a couple of demonstrations, like how we can create a virtual machine, and I'll also talk about how we can create a Kubernetes cluster and deploy some containers and so on. So typically, an Azure administrator will be responsible for Kubernetes service as well. And likewise, Azure administrator will also want to set up or configure virtual networks, so that your virtual machines on Azure, they should be able to connect to each other, and you'll most likely want to make sure that your on-prem equipment is also able to connect to on-cloud sort of resources and so on. So in short, it's all about the management and implementation of your resources, creating some rules and regulations around those resources, and so on. And definitely monitoring as well. So you'll want to make sure that once you have provisioned your resources, you monitor things on day-to-day basis. So just like in your on-prem environment, usually you use performance monitoring sort of tools. Like, if nothing else, you use perfmon, the built-in Windows specific tool. You could use event logs and so on. So likewise, we have to monitor things in Azure as well. And I'll talk about various services that are available on Azure, that you get to use for monitoring and so on. So in a nutshell, if you're an on-prem administrator, you'll still get to do the similar things, but it's just that you'll get to do everything on Azure. And sure, in advanced cases, you'll want to make sure that you have a hybrid cloud. So hybrid cloud basically means that if this is your Azure environment, data centers are owned by Microsoft, and you will provision your resources on this public cloud. So we can call this public cloud. And you also have, let's say, your on-prem setup as well. You have your database servers, web servers, application servers, etc., and so on. And you want to make sure that you want to keep some of the data in your on-prem environment. Like if you want to keep your database server here, but you want to deploy your application server here, then in that case, you'll want to make sure you set up your hybrid cloud. So if this is your private cloud on-prem, and this is your public cloud, then hybrid cloud means make sure that your on-prem services, they are also able to connect to your on cloud sort of services and so on, or vice versa as well. So even that is usually the responsibility of a typical administrator or Azure administrator. Okay, so keeping this in mind, let's cover what are the typical tools that are utilized by any Azure administrator. Then I'll give you overview of some of these tools later on in this session. So typically we get to use the website that is known as Azure Portal. So Azure Portal is basically this particular website. You do have to sign up for Azure. You need a valid subscription. I'll talk about subscriptions later on. For now, I'll just connect to my Azure portal. So here in this portal, we can see pretty much all the services that are offered by Azure, and there are hundreds of them. So if you click this all services, you will see tons and tons of services. So there's artificial intelligence, there's big data, there is support for creating Kubernetes cluster, deploy Docker containers, create container registry, create virtual machines. So sky's the limit. So there are tons and tons of options available here. So we get to use this portal as one of the tools, and we also get to use PowerShell or Azure command line scripting sort of options. So you can install Azure CLI SDK on your local machine. This way you'll be able to use your regular command prompt or PowerShell prompt. You'll be able to write some scripts to create various resources and so on. In just a bit, I'll show you an example like how we can write a basic PowerShell script that should create a virtual machine on Azure automatically and so on. So you can choose to use this PowerShell Azure CLI, or if you're using a web browser, let's say you're using let's say $100 or $200 Chromebook, and you cannot install PowerShell there. It's not possible to install PowerShell on a Chromebook. So if you are using just a web browser, but you still want to write some scripts, then in that case, you can use something that is known as Azure Cloud Shell. So Azure Cloud Shell is basically available here. If you click this icon here in Azure Portal, it will launch this shell environment for us. It's all part of the web browser, or I should rather say part of the website. So this is basically just HTML, and you'll be able to write your scripts here. You can write your shell scripts, you can write your PowerShell scripts, you can toggle between the two. So if you're coming from shell scripting or Linux background, you will want to use a bash shell script. Otherwise, if you're coming from Windows background, you can use PowerShell. Otherwise, these days, PowerShell is actually available on Linux as well, because it is now a cross-platform scripting solution. So these days, it doesn't really matter whether you use PowerShell or you use bash shell. It depends on your personal ease of use, basically. So here I'm starting up PowerShell, and it's all part of this website. It's all HTML5, basically. You can view the source code if you want of this HTML page, basically, not of Azure backend or something like that. So you can execute some scripts and so on. And I'll do that in just a bit. I'll show you how to provision a virtual machine on Azure by writing a PowerShell script. And then we also get to use, or we can optionally utilize Azure Resource Management templates as well. That is also known as ARM templates. So I'll talk about ARM templates in just a bit when I show you how to create a virtual machine. I'll point out what exactly this ARM concept is. And optionally, you can also choose to use Azure mobile app as well. You can install it on your Android, iPhone devices. That's an official app provided by Microsoft, and you can use it to create various types of resources. You can also run PowerShell scripts, Bash shell scripts directly from your cell phone as well if you want. Okay, and then before I show you how to create a virtual machine and so on, let's have a quick overview of various deployment or cloud models. So if you have an on-prem environment and you want to start using Azure, you have lots of options. And here in just this 1 hour session, it will be impossible to cover all the options. But generally speaking, you have 3 main options. So if in case of on-premises environment, you're responsible for the whole thing, like your hardware as well as the operating system and the rest of the software. If you use infrastructure as a service option, you will not be responsible for the hardware. Hardware will be the responsibility of Microsoft. You just have to say, I need 4 GB RAM, I need 2 CPUs, that's it. Then you will be responsible for the operating system, install any OS of your choice, install any runtime like JDK, .NET Framework, .NET Core, Node.js, Python, PHP, etc. And then you get to focus on your custom application, and then you also focus on your data as well, like databases and so on. So basically, this is sort of equivalent to your VM sort of environment. If you're already using VMware, Hyper-V, VirtualBox, infrastructure as a service is equivalent to that. So let's quickly see this thing. So you can choose to use this website. Here you can search for virtual machines. Let me minimize this Cloud Shell for now. You can create a new virtual machine here. For now, ignore this resource group concept, but generally speaking, you have to group your resources together. So this way, if you have a sales application, you have inventory marketing application, and they all require a virtual machine, they require some database server, they need a web server, they need application servers, you can group them together for the sake of ease of use and so on. Name it whatever you want, specify where you want to provision your resource, specify what OS template you want to use. Otherwise, in advanced cases, you can also upload your own custom VM images as well if you want. You can specify your hardware configuration that you want to utilize, and then you can configure your disk, your storage. Basically, you can configure your networking options as well. Like, do you want to create multiple subnets or not? Do you want to expose certain port numbers or not, and so on. And eventually, when you are done, on the very last page of this wizard, it will let you download a template for automation. This is basically a JSON file, and you can choose to use this JSON file for automation purpose if you want. I won't bother completing this particular thing. Instead, I'll show you how to create a VM by using a PowerShell script. So you can definitely choose to use the web browser, and from the web browser or the graphical interface, and from the graphical interface, you can download some automation scripts. They are the JSON files, and you can run those files if you want. They're also known as Azure Resource Management sort of templates. Otherwise, if you prefer writing scripts like shell scripts or PowerShell scripts, something like that, you can do that as well. So for that purpose, let me run some scripts here. So let's say, first of all, we want to make sure whatever VM you want to create, we should have some username and a password configured for it. So let's say I'll use admin123, and password will be this one. So basically, I've created a variable here where I've specified what credentials I want to use for a VM that I'm about to set up here. Then here I can also specify the VM parameters, like where exactly I want to provision the VM, what base operating system or image I want to utilize, and I'm also passing it the credentials, and then I'm also specifying that a certain port number should be enabled in something that is known as network security group, that is equivalent to firewall concept. So basically we have a configuration for our VM. And then to create our actual VM, we need to run this particular new AZ VM. And this is all part of PowerShell basically. So it's creating a VM based on the configuration that we have already passed to it. So eventually we will have a Windows-based VM. And then I'll show you how to connect to it as well from the local machine. So if you have an on-prem setup and you do not want to use your local hardware resources, you want to save on the cost, you can migrate your VMs to Azure. You will save a lot of money. You can actually search for something called Azure Pricing Calculator. If you go to the pricing calculator, you can actually get some cost estimates, like how much cost savings you will have and so on. So you can say that I want to get the cost estimates for a virtual machine, for whatever other resource you want. You can specify whether you already have your operating system license. You can choose to say that, yes, we already have the license. You'll have to pay roughly $85 per month for this hardware configuration. 8 GB RAM, 2 CPUs. You can choose to select some other configuration as well if you want. So basically, cost is very predictive here. There's no upfront cost at all. It's all pay-as-you-go sort of cost. So it's a very low-cost solution compared to owning your own hardware and so on. Okay, so in the meanwhile, we can see that our VM has been provisioned. Let's verify that we have the VM provisioned. What's the configuration? We can see that, yes, it's provisioned. We can see the FQDN, fully qualified domain name as well, that we'll be able to use to connect to our VM. We can also optionally get the admin username that we have configured for the VM. And then we can also get the IP address that has been assigned to our VM. IP addresses can be of two types here. We can have a public IP address and also a private IP address. So private IP address means this will be accessible only from other VMs in this cloud environment. Or if you have the hybrid cloud, your on-prem VMs will also be able to connect to this particular private IP address. But no public user will be able to connect to it. Whereas if you want any outsider, like you want to connect to your machine from some different network, like I'm going to connect to it from my local machine. So for that, we can obtain the public IP address. And let me make sure that we have all these scripts executed. Okay, let me obtain the private IP address and then the public IP address one more time. And next we need to get the actual IP. Okay, so my public IP address is this one. We can also choose to use this FQDN as well to connect to our VM that's running on Azure. So let's make a note of this particular FQDN, or you can also get the IP address as well if you want. And then I can go to my local machine and we can launch Microsoft Terminal Services. To this Microsoft Terminal Services, we can pass it the FQDN or the public IP address. It's up to you. I think my clipboard is currently not taking the value. Let me just type in the IP address for now. Okay, so here we can see that my local machine is, or terminal services is connecting to the Azure hosted VM. And in just a matter of 5 minutes or so, we have a VM up and running on Azure, and we're able to connect to it from our local machine. You can even connect to your Azure hosted VMs from your iPads, your Android tablets, Chromebooks as well, and so on. So basically all the horsepower will be provided by Azure. And we have a full-blown Windows operating system here. So the first time startup, so that's why it's taking just a little bit of time. Eventually it will show us. So this is Windows Server 2016. We can see the full-blown environment here with no limitations whatsoever and so on. And then just to save on the resources, I'll shut down my VM. In fact, I'll just delete the entire resource group so that I do not have to pay anything for it and so on. So usually when you start any service, or let's say you create a VM and the VM is up and running, you pay for it. And when you deallocate your VM, you stop paying for it. So VM is definitely one of the primary responsibilities of any Azure administrator. So if you already have VMs in your on-prem environment, you can choose to utilize the VMs on cloud as well. And later on, I'll talk about some migration options, like how you can make it easier when it comes to migrating your existing VM setup to Azure and so on. Otherwise, if nothing else, you can create a new VM from scratch, install all your application servers, web servers, database servers from scratch and so on. Then likewise, we also have something that is known as platform as a service, or we also usually call it serverless computing option. So in case of serverless, as the name suggests, there is no server to manage. There's no hardware to worry about, and there's no operating system to worry about. So you do not even care for the OS. You only care for your custom runtimes. Like you want to have JDK, .NET, you want to have some application servers, like you can use JBoss, WebLogic, WebSphere, IIS, whatever you want, and then you get to focus on your custom application. So if you just focus on your custom solution and the prerequisites or the dependencies required by your custom solution, that is typically known as platform as a service or serverless computing option. So in case of serverless, usually we also call it PaaS, platform as a service, we have quite a few options available. One of the most popular options is to use Docker containers along with Kubernetes. So those guys who are already using containers and Kubernetes in on-prem environment, you can use the exact same concepts on Azure with next to no changes whatsoever. Whereas those guys who are not currently using Docker containers and Kubernetes, you should consider using it because it's a very low cost solution compared to VMs. In case of the VMs, you always have to pay for the number of CPUs, the number of or the amount of RAM. And you have to keep in mind that the OS needs to breathe as well. So it needs some extra processing power. It also needs to consume some memory as well. So if you want to say that, no, why should I have to worry about the operating system? I only care for my business. My business needs certain dependencies and just our custom solution. I do not want to be responsible for the OS. Why do I have to pay for the OS? So that is where you can start using Docker containers. You only pay for your custom application that is hosted along with the dependencies, but not for the OS. So OS is not your headache. The hardware is not your headache. The OS is not your headache. So keeping this brief concept in mind, in reality, it's a very huge area. We have several detailed courses just on this concept. So keeping this concept in mind that containers, they let you worry about just your application that is needed by the business. Whereas the OS is not really the main business requirement, it's a technical requirement. And we don't want to pay for the operating system at all. That's where you get to use Azure Container Service along with Kubernetes. So keeping this in mind, here as a case study, what I'll do is I'll deploy a container. So this is out of the scope of this particular session to talk about how to create custom containers. We have detailed sessions on just this particular topic. So here we will already have a ready-made Docker image that already contains a sample application known as SonarQube. It's just a case study application just to explain that a typical application will require several dependencies. Like it will require some database server. And SonarQube, typically out of the box, it requires MySQL database server. It also requires some web server. So web server wise, SonarQube utilizes Apache Web Server. It also requires plugins for PHP, and then you get to install SonarQube server itself. Then you get to configure so many things and so on. So if you have to install any typical application in on-prem environment, you have to worry about so many different things. Even in case of virtual machines, you will have to worry about all these things. How do I install database server? How to install my web server? How do I configure all these things? Then you get to focus on your actual application that you want to use. In this case, it is SonarQube. Docker containers, they contain the entire application along with the dependencies. So everything will be there in your Docker image. So all you have to do is you just have to deploy it. And if you want to deploy this thing, for that there are various options, but here I'll use Kubernetes option. And before I talk about or I'll show you Kubernetes, one small note here is that this Docker image, eventually when you deploy it, it will become a container. And in a real world scenario, you'll end up having several containers. Like you will have a container that contains your sales application, a container that contains your inventory, general ledger, marketing, payroll, account sort of applications, and so on. So you will end up having several containers. And Kubernetes allows you to group these containers. So you can say we want to have a deployment that contains several applications and so on. Like you can have your sales, marketing, general ledger, payroll, accounts, human resources, sort of containers here. And Kubernetes will let you easily manage multiple related containers. It will also let you implement automatic failover. So auto failover, as the name suggests, if any container has crashed due to whatever reason, some alternate container will become available to us automatically. So likewise, it also offers load balancing as well. So auto failover and load balancing, definitely these are not new concepts. We have been using it in our on-prem environment, but you have to pay a lot in your on-prem environment when you use auto failover and load balancing, because you need machines, multiple machines that can act as your backup machines and as your load balancers and so on. Whereas when you use Docker container concept with Kubernetes, there are no machines to worry about. Machines are not your headache. The operating system is not your headache. Your only headache is your custom application and the dependencies that are contained in Docker containers. So when you use Kubernetes, it's basically letting you manage your containers and also letting you manage your auto failover, load balancing options, and so on. So in a nutshell, Kubernetes is sort of infrastructure as a service option, but minus the operating system and the hardware for that operating system. You never have to worry about how do I install service packs and security patches for the operating system. All you have to worry about is deployment of your custom applications that are contained in Docker containers. So Kubernetes is like infrastructure as a service option, but it is serverless, because you never get to worry about the server or the operating system at all. So keeping this in mind, let me quickly show you how we can deploy a sample Docker application, like let's say SonarQube. It's basically used by quite a few companies as a code quality testing tool. So if you want to check for your code quality, like there should not be any let's say memory leaks or SQL injection sort of issues, or some other security issues, or even maintainability sort of issues, like the code should be easy to maintain in future and so on. For that, we could use SonarQube to check for the code quality. So here I'll quickly connect to my shell, and then I'll show you how we can deploy our SonarQube as a case study application that will be available in our Docker container and so on. Okay, so here, first of all, I need to make sure that my shell is aware of the cloud or a Kubernetes environment that I already have set up here. So how do we set up Kubernetes? That's out of the scope of this particular session. We have it covered in the full-blown courses. Optionally, we can see how many nodes. You can think of nodes as sort of physical machines that are not your responsibilities. So these are 3 nodes available by default in this particular Kubernetes configuration. So this way, if one node has crashed, you still have 2 nodes available. Currently, I do not have any application deployed at all. I'm going to deploy SonarQube Docker image. It will become part of this Kubernetes serverless environment. Then we can verify we have the application deployed. Our application is up and running. And then we need to make sure that our application is, or the service is exposed over the network, so we can connect it from outside of this particular Kubernetes environment. Let's obtain the IP address. So the external IP address for this particular deployment is still getting assigned. It's in pending state right now, so we have to wait for a few more seconds. When it shows us the public IP address, now we can start connecting to it. Let's copy this particular IP address. In fact, I can send this in the chat window to everyone. So even on your side, you guys can connect to it. Port number is 9000 in this case. So in your chat window, there's a URL. If you access this particular URL, you'll be able to see SonarQube environment. It might take a bit of time the first time around, since it takes a bit of time to warm up. Eventually, it will show us the service. So in short, so here we can see the SonarQube environment. So we have deployed our Docker image that contains SonarQube and all the dependencies, like Apache Web Server, MySQL, PHP plugins, etc., and so on. So usually when you contain your application, it becomes super easy to deploy your application by using Kubernetes and so on. So there's no headache of any operating system management at all. It makes things much cheaper, and also there's no downside to it. Like, it's still highly scalable. There's load balancing, etc., in place. In fact, you can say that as a backup, you want to have multiple instances of this particular SonarQube application. So for that, you can choose to scale out your setup. So I can say that I want to have 3 identical instances or replicas of the same service. So notice that 2 more identical replicas are getting created here. Eventually, they will both show us 1 out of 1. That means the instances are up and running and so on. And Kubernetes will offer or provide auto failover, load balancing sort of functionalities and so on. So now we can see that all 3 instances, they are up and running. That is insane. If we had to do something like that with VMs, it would have taken much longer. You would have to pay a lot as well, because you have to pay for the number of CPUs, the amount of RAM. The operating system needs to occupy some storage as well. So you're cutting down on a lot of resources. You're paying a fraction of the cost, but without losing out on any benefits and so on. So basically, Kubernetes is a very useful option. And we don't have too much time in this session. Otherwise, I would have loved to show you some more demos. For now, I'll just show you or explain the concepts. So as part of Platform as a Service, we can choose to utilize Kubernetes along with Docker containers. Or if you want to simplify things even further, you want to say that, no, I just want to focus on my application. Like I have a .NET application or a Java-based application, and I just want to deploy it without any headache of how do I even create my own Docker container? How do I even configure Kubernetes and so on? So if you want to make things even easier, you can choose to use something that is known as App Service. So App Service you can think of it as equivalent to your, let's say, IIS or any other application server that is pre-installed. It's a pre-installed application server basically, and you just get to deploy your application. That is it. And deployment wise, you can basically deploy your zip files. So you can take all your dependencies or your artifacts, your executables and so on, and you can create a single zip file, and you can publish that zip file. So this is the easiest possible option, app service. And then as an Azure administrator, you'll also be responsible for configuring security as well as setting up your identity management as well. Like in your on-prem environment, we typically have Active Directory. So likewise, you will have Active Directory available on Azure as well. That is known as Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is available on Azure. That lets you, let's just search for the word Active Directory. It will show us Azure Active Directory. So here you can choose to create your user accounts, who should have access to your services, like your VMs, your containers, your other services and so on. So you can add more user accounts here. Or if you want to say that, no, we already have an on-prem Active Directory. All I want to do is just take the users as it is and make sure that they have access to Azure as well. So in that case, you can utilize AD Connect option. So if you go to your Active Directory, here you will see AD Connect option. It's basically a tool. You have to download it, install it on your local on-prem environment. Then this will let you synchronize your on-prem users to your Azure Active Directory users and groups and so on. So this way you can choose to extend it further, use federation option. This way you can have single sign-on as well. So single sign-on would mean that if you have some applications hosted on Azure, the users will not be required to log in again if they are already connected to your corporate network, to the same Active Directory that you own in your on-prem environment and so on. So basically the same token will be utilized for authenticating the users on Azure as well. So in advanced cases, we get to configure single sign-on. And we can also use these users that we have added to Active Directory to configure security and permissions as well. So if you have any resource, I don't think I have the VM up and running anymore since I ended up running a script that has deleted the resource. So now I can go to some other resource. So let's imagine that this is a VM that you provisioned previously. So here we can go to this access control, identity access management, and we can assign roles to the users, assign permissions basically. So who should have access to what? So for example, if I say that you need to secure this thing, you'll be able to see various permissions or roles here. So depending on what type of resource you have, you will see various roles here. So we have roles for Kubernetes, we have roles for VMs, we have roles for pretty much every major resource and so on, or service basically. As a Azure administrator, you'll be responsible for security. And you can also configure multi-factor authentication. That means rather than relying on just a username and password, we can choose to rely on some authenticator, like some hardware sort of key, or if nothing else, you can install Microsoft Authenticator app on your cell phone, and you'll basically be asked to type in some random numbers that are getting displayed in that app and so on. So every 30 seconds, the random numbers will change, and you can use that option as well. And Azure Policy is usually also configured by the administrators so that we can restrict access to certain resources to everyone. So not even the administrators should be allowed to create certain resources. Like it's our, let's say due to our compliance requirements, or due to our governance requirement, or some rules and regulations, we do not want to create any VM outside of Canada. It must be within the Canadian borders and so on. So in that case, you can configure the policies and so on. So for that, we get to utilize policy definitions, policy assignments, and so on. So that's usually also the responsibility of Azure Administrator. And networking wise, when you set up your VMs, they will definitely want to use networks. So this way you can have multiple machines. They can all belong to separate networks. Like say you have multiple branch offices, you can choose to have, let's say, a branch office here, or let's say this is branch office number 1. It can have multiple VMs. So you can create a network for just this branch office, and you can also create subnets here. So this way we can have our production environment, dev environment, test environment, etc. and so on. They can all have multiple machines, and they can all be part of separate subnets and so on. And likewise, we can have another, let's say, a branch office with its own collection of subnets, multiple VMs and so on. So we can have multiple networks or virtual networks. And these virtual networks can be connected to your on-prem environment as well to implement hybrid sort of cloud. And they can also be interconnected as well. So inter-site connectivity is also available here. Usually for that, we get to use something that is known as VNet peering. So this way, even though these are geographically located in different regions, but they should still be able to connect to each other and so on. And likewise, an Azure administrator will also be responsible for configuring security groups or NSGs. These are equivalent to firewalls, basically. We can also configure VPN, like point-to-site, site-to-site sort of VPNs and so on, depending on what topology you want to implement, who should be able to connect to what machine, etc. and so on. And then for better performance, we get to use something that is known as express route. So performance-wise, if this is your local machine or environment or network, and the data center is located way out there, how do you ensure that you get the optimal performance when you connect from local machine to or local network to your Azure hosted sort of resources? So although VPN and VNets, etc. and so on, they are helpful, but to get the top-notch performance, you'll want to use this express route option. So this will be a dedicated connection between your network and Azure hosted resources. So express route is available here for better performance. And if you have, let's say, your on-prem RAID or SAN or NAS storage requirement, basically, for that, we can utilize Azure Storage on cloud. So Azure Storage allows us to store documents in various formats or in various ways, basically. So if you want to use SMB protocol so that you can connect to your file system with no extra development required, the developers should not be required to change the code to connect to your storage system, basically. For that, we have something that is known as Azure Files. So Azure Files is a feature of Azure that lets you create your NAS, SAN sort of, or SMB compatible sort of storage where you can store any type of document, create folders, subfolders, create your or store your documents, and your VMs, whether they are on cloud or in your on-prem environment, they will all be able to connect to that common storage. So Azure Files is very useful for that. And when you want to synchronize your files, like from one, let's say, your on-prem environment to Azure, for that we have various options such as file sync. We have AZ copy option available as well if you want to just perform a one-time deployment. Otherwise, if you want to continuously synchronize your file system, your on-prem file system and your Azure hosted file system, we could use file sync for that. So in the full-blown detailed courses, we cover all these things in detail. We discuss how to set up these things, how to utilize these things practically and so on. And Azure administrators are also responsible for taking backups. So you can use Azure Backup Service to take the backup of your VMs or your databases, your storage account as well. So this will be sort of your cold backup sort of solution. Actually, we have various options. We have hot, warm, cold. We also have archive option as well. So we have various strategies. So if you want a traditional backup, something that you restore only when there is a major disaster, you can use Azure Backup option. And if you want to say that, no, we don't want to take backup of individual things one at a time, we want to group things together. So this VM and some other VM and the storage, we need to take the backup of these things together as a whole. For that, we have recovery service vault available. This actually supports both your cloud hosted as well as your on-prem workloads or your resources. Like even your on-prem cloud or your on-prem environment can be included in the backup as well, or in this recovery service vault. It supports a soft delete concept. That means that if someone has deleted any resource, you can always recover it. So think of it as a fancy recycle bin that's available at pretty much any level, like even at a VM level as well. If a VM is deleted, you can always recover that as well. So it's sort of your recycle bin sort of concept. And if you want to migrate your existing systems, your on-prem systems to Azure, or from one environment to another environment, like let's say from one Azure location or region to another Azure region, or from Azure to AWS, or the other way around, AWS to Azure, or on-prem to Azure. If you have full-blown VMs and you want to just migrate them as it is with next to no changes whatsoever, that is where you can utilize this Azure Site Recovery option. It's a very useful option that will simplify your migration process a lot. And then usually Azure administrators are also responsible for monitoring the system as well. So just like we usually use Performance Monitor to look at the performance metrics and so on. So likewise, we have Azure Monitor here. You can add various or monitor various metrics. You can also create dashboards and look at the metrics in real time. You can also configure alerts so that if something happens, like let's say your cost, let's say you have some budgeted cost for some resource. So you're saying that you do not want to have more than, let's say, $1,000 spent on a particular VM per month. You can configure your budgets. You can also configure your alerts. And then when the cost goes past that budgeted amount, it will send you email notifications and so on. And just like in case of on-prem environment, we have event log or event viewer concept. Likewise, we have log analytics that you can use to look at your logs, to troubleshoot things and so on. In fact, we have application insights available as well that can let you look at or configure logs at an individual application level. So app insights along with log analytics is available. And it has its own query language that you can use to query your huge log files with ease. So this way you can filter out the logs with ease. So in short, Azure Administrator typically is responsible for the similar things like management of your infrastructure and so on, but there are different types of infrastructures here. There is a VM or virtual machine based infrastructure. There is a Kubernetes / container based infrastructure. There is also just a simple application server or your platform as a server sort of option as well, that is known as app service, where you do not have to worry about any infrastructure or operating system, or even for Docker containers, you're only responsible for the application itself. So there are different types of infrastructures. And there's security around all these infrastructure options. There is monitoring involved around all these options. There is governance, policy configuration is required as well, and so on. And definitely networking has to be configured as well, like what component should be able to access what other component and so on. You should be able to configure your backups, recover the solution if there is any disaster, etc. and so on. Okay, so in this session, we just went through some of the main concepts. We do have full-blown detailed courses available. So we have a separate course just for administrators. We have courses for developers, for data engineers, data scientists, artificial intelligence sort of developers, solution architects, etc. as well, and so on. Okay, so any question regarding this session? The link to the webinar will be emailed to you guys. So basically, once the recording is done, we will process the video and then we will upload it to our site, and then you'll get the link to it. And you'll be able to see the slides as well on the same site. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. It was a pleasure to be here with you for this session.